Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a time when medicine was less about sterile instruments and more about grinding up whatever you happen to find in a tomb. So, if you're lying there under a blanket, ready for some soothing history, don't worry. I promise not to be too energetic. We're going to sink slowly into one of the more questionable chapters of human ingenuity, the belief that eating pieces of dead people was a perfectly legitimate medical treatment. Yes, we're talking about mummy medicine. And no, this isn't about some esoteric ritual in an Egyptian temple. This was mainstream, European, well-to-do, your doctor recommends it kind of stuff. For several centuries, the fashionable cure for everything from headaches to nosebleeds was powdered corpse. Now, I realize that it's not exactly what you wanted to picture as you were drifting off to sleep. But the truth is, history is rarely hygienic, and medieval medicine was particularly fond of turning suffering into recipes. Let's set the scene. It's the 12th century. You're not feeling well. Maybe it's a migraine. Maybe it's something worse, like that vague medieval catch-all. Bad humors. You shuffle off to the apothecary, a place filled with jars of herbs, resins, minerals, and little bags of things that look suspiciously like dried lizards. And sitting on one shelf, in a prized position, is the real treasure, a lump of imported Egyptian mummy. Yes, actual human remains. Because, naturally, people thought that mummies were full of mysterious powers. Egypt had been exoticized since the time of the Greeks. To Europeans, it was a land of magic, wisdom, and desserts that somehow preserved bodies for millennia. So, the logic, if you want to call it that, went something like this. If a body could resist decay for thousands of years, surely it must contain some special essence. And surely, if we consume it, that essence will cure us. Now, you might be thinking, did people really just snack on mummies? Not exactly. The body wasn't eaten whole. It was ground, boiled, distilled, and sold in little doses. Apothecaries advertised it like we'd advertise vitamins today. Feeling weak? A pinch of mummy powder in your wine. Chronic headaches? Try some mummy syrup, and because people will pay good money for health fads, demand skyrocketed. Unfortunately, there's only so many authentic Egyptian mummies to go around. By the Renaissance, the supply problem had gotten creative, which is historian code for people made it worse. So, what did they do when they ran out of ancient mummies? They simply made more. Grave robbers in Egypt realized that if you couldn't find a 2,000-year-old mummy, you could dig up a fresher corpse, cover it in bitumen and resin, let it dry in the desert sun for a bit, and new mummy, ready for export. Europeans couldn't really tell the difference. To be fair, most buyers had never been to Egypt. To them, a mummy just meant a dark, resin-coated lump that vaguely resembled a human limb. And so, much of Europe's medicine supply was less ancient pharaoh and more last week's unfortunate local. Naturally, this didn't stop anyone. At this point, you might be wondering, did it work? Well, in the sense that people believed it worked, yes, the placebo effect is a powerful thing. But no, medically, eating powdered mummy didn't cure you. Unless, of course, your problem was not having consumed enough ground-up corpse today. Some physicians, however, doubled down. They insisted that mummies contained a kind of mystical substance called mumia, a tar-like resin that was thought to preserve life. The name mummy actually comes from the Persian mum, meaning wax or bitumen. Doctors thought the body had been preserved by soaking up this magical tar. So, if you ate it, you absorbed the preserving power too. It's the kind of logic that makes sense if you think about it too hard. And who was buying this stuff? Everyone. Kings, nobles, the wealthy, and anyone who could scrape together enough coin to purchase it. The French king, Francis I, was said to keep a little packet of powdered mummy with him at all times, in case of sudden illness. Because naturally, if you're the ruler of France, you want to make sure you're topped up on your daily corpse vitamins. Now, not everyone was convinced. A few physicians did suggest that perhaps consuming dried human flesh wasn't the best medical idea. But these were a minority. Most doctors happily prescribed it for centuries. Even as late as the 17th century, respected medical textbooks were still listing mummy as a standard treatment. It wasn't fringe medicine, it was medicine. And just when you think it couldn't get any stranger, it does. Because mummy medicine wasn't the only form of cannibal cure. In fact, it opened the door to a whole industry of body-based treatments. Blood, fat, bones, skulls. If a human had it, someone tried to bottle it and sell it. We'll drift gently into those curiosities soon enough. But before we do, let's pause and appreciate the sheer oddity of the scene. European nobles, sitting in their candlelit chambers, sipping wine sweetened with sugar imported from the Indies and stirred with a spoonful of Egyptian mummy. A romantic evening, with just a hint of corpse. Of course, when demand outpaces supply, fraud runs rampant. Apothecaries across Europe began offering powders labeled as true mummy, which often turned out to be powdered bark, resin, or even crushed bits of asphalt. Because yes, selling literal road tar was still considered safer than running out of corpses. And people complained about this. Fake mummy was a hot topic. Buyers would say things like, "This doesn't feel like real human remains," which is not a sentence anyone should ever need to say. But authenticity mattered. If you were going to cure your migraines with the dead, you wanted the genuine article. Now, you might think this practice faded quickly once people realized it was nonsense. But history rarely moves in tidy lines. Instead, mummy medicine lingered on stubbornly. Physicians debated the best ways to prepare it. Some said the best mummy was dried flesh. Others said it had to be steeped in wine. Still others swore that the finest healing substance came not from Egyptian tombs at all, but from criminals freshly executed at the gallows. Yes, because if you couldn't get an ancient pharaoh, why not try a thief? Executioners in parts of Germany were known to sell little vials of fresh blood at the gallows. Spectators would rush forward with cups, dip them in the warm blood, and drink it on the spot, believing it cured epilepsy. And once you've got people doing that, powdered mummy doesn't seem quite as extreme anymore. But we'll float toward that part of the story in a moment. For now, picture it. Medieval Europe, a society deeply suspicious of witches and sorcery, yet entirely comfortable with eating human remains in the name of science. Because of course they were. So, you're probably still picturing the noble courts of Europe, where kings and queens sipped their mummy-infused wine and nodded approvingly, as though this was perfectly normal. But of course, medicine being medicine, once you've normalized eating ancient flesh, the door opens to all sorts of culinary adventures, which brings us gently into the realm of other cannibal cures. Because yes, mummy was fashionable, but it was only the beginning. Let's start with blood. For centuries, Europeans believed that fresh, warm blood had special powers. This wasn't just about symbolism. Blood was thought to contain the very essence of life. If you had too little, you weakened. If you had too much, you might burst a vein. Hence, the medieval obsession with bloodletting, which usually did more harm than good. But some bright minds decided to reverse the process. Instead of draining you of blood, why not drink someone else's? Particularly someone young and full of vitality. And where better to find such a supply than at a public execution? Yes, executions weren't just grim spectacles. They doubled as pharmacies. When a criminal was hanged, or more dramatically, beheaded, the executioner often found himself mobbed by a thirsty crowd. People with epilepsy were especially eager. They would rush forward, sometimes dipping cups or cloths into the still warm blood, and drink it down right there, believing it would stop their seizures. Imagine that scene, a medieval town square, the executioner wiping his blade, while a small queue forms at his side. Not to condemn him, but to ask politely for a sample. It's all a bit unsettling. And yet, in its own twisted way, practical. Waste not, want not. Of course, not everyone had the opportunity to attend public executions. So apothecaries stepped in to provide bottled blood, often dried and powdered for easier storage. You could mix it into a tonic, sprinkle it in wine, or, if you were really fancy, coat it in sugar to make medicinal pills. Because naturally, if you're eating people, you may as well make it taste nice. Next, let's drift softly toward human fat. This was particularly popular in Germany and parts of Central Europe. Executioners, once again, became important suppliers. They didn't just deal in blood, they also rendered down the fat of freshly executed criminals, producing a substance that could be sold as a salve. The fat was believed to ease joint pain, reduce swelling, and cure a range of skin problems. People rubbed it on their bodies like a medieval version of Vicks VapoRub. Some even cooked with it, though that was generally frowned upon, unless you were very pragmatic about sourcing ingredients. Executioners often had a tidy side business selling this poor man's balm, and for a profession already shunned as unclean, it was at least a profitable niche. If you were going to be excluded from polite society, you might as well corner the market on corpse fat. And then, of course, there were bones and skulls. Powdered skull was considered particularly effective against headaches, which, if you think about it, has a kind of grim poetic logic. Skull for skull. If your head hurts, just ingest a bit of someone else's head. That should balance things out. Apothecaries kept whole skulls on their shelves, sometimes gilded or painted because presentation mattered. You could grate a little off, like Parmesan on a pasta dish, or grind the whole thing into powder. The choice was yours. In some recipes, the skull had to be from a young person. Others insisted it should be from someone who had died violently, as though the suddenness of death preserved extra vitality. And of course, fresh was always considered best. The recently dead were seen as brimming with medical energy, because naturally, nothing says health tonic quite like scraping powder off a skull that was buried yesterday. The truth is, the idea of sympathetic magic ran through much of this. The body part was thought to carry its function with it. Eat skull to help your head. Drink blood to give you vigor. Apply fat to soothe your aching joints. It all tied neatly into the logic of like cures, and before you roll your eyes too hard at medieval thinking, remember, we still do this in less horrifying ways today. Collagen supplements, bone broth, organ meats, advertised for health. It's the same principle, just with fewer gallows involved. Now, what's interesting is that this wasn't some underground practice. Cannibal medicine was respected. Physicians wrote about it in serious treatises. Kings endorsed it. It was sold openly in markets. The wealthy and the poor alike believed in it. This wasn't witchcraft or fringe superstition. This was medicine, and that makes the contrast even stranger. On one hand, European society was horrified by the idea of ritual cannibalism in savage cultures abroad. They told horror stories about the New World and accused indigenous people of barbarity. Meanwhile, back home, they were stirring dried blood into their morning beer. But of course, hypocrisy is also timeless. Let's drift for a moment into the Renaissance, where cannibal cures reached their height. This wasn't just peasants and quacks. The elite physicians of the 16th and 17th centuries actively promoted it. The philosopher Francis Bacon recommended corpse remedies. The scientist Robert Boilius of Boyle's Lotus kissed powdered skulls as medicine. Even the respectable Sir Thomas Browne, who liked to debunk superstitions, admitted that mummy powder was a medicine most frequent among us. And so, in candlelit libraries and marble palaces, Europe's great thinkers and rulers quietly consumed the dead, not because they were morbid, but because it was fashionable. If you weren't taking mummy powder, you weren't keeping up with the times. Of course, fashions fade. By the 18th century, skepticism grew. Enlightenment thinkers began to dismiss corpse medicine as barbaric. Apothecaries still sold it, but it was increasingly associated with the old ways. By the 19th century, the trade in mummy powder had withered, lingering only in the fringes of folk medicine. But for nearly 500 years, Europeans casually consumed their dead. And when you think about it, that's a long time to keep a medical fad alive. Longer than most diets, certainly. So, as you drift deeper into sleep, just remember, the next time you're retold that people used to be more civilized, you can quietly picture a 17th century noblewoman sipping a cordial with a hint of powdered skull. Because of course she was. So, let's talk about family trees, or rather, family vines, because in many royal houses of Europe, branches weren't exactly the point. The point was keeping everything in the family. If you've ever heard the phrase, married his cousin, well, in royal Europe, that wasn't unusual. That was Tuesday. Because dynasties believed that mixing with outsiders weakened their bloodline. The irony being, of course, that keeping it to pure usually resulted in fragile, sickly heirs with more genetic problems than titles. Take, for instance, the Habsburgs. Ah, yes, the great ruling family of Europe. They were famous for ruling vast territories, and also for their jaw. The Habsburg jaw, as it became known, was so pronounced that portraits almost looked like caricatures. But they weren't exaggerations. The lower jaw jutted so far forward that eating, speaking, and even closing the mouth could be difficult. Why did this happen? Because for generations, the Habsburgs married close relatives, uncles to nieces, cousins to cousins. In some cases, a royal child might have fewer unique great-grandparents than you or I have second cousins. The genetic bottleneck reached its tragic climax with Charles II of Spain, also known as El Hechizado, or the Bewitched. Charles II was, to put it gently, not well. Born in 1661, he was the product of so much inbreeding that his family tree looked like someone had drawn a circle. His Habsburg jaw was so severe that he couldn't chew properly. He struggled to speak. His body was frail, stunted, and riddled with health problems. And yet, he was king of Spain. Now, Spain at the time was a sprawling empire, rich in colonies, armies, and power. And its ruler was a man who couldn't walk until the age of 8, who was described by his doctors as having the body and mind of a child. He suffered seizures, digestive issues, and infertility. His marriages produced no heirs. By his late 30s, he was bald, toothless, and often unable to get out of bed. The Spanish court whispered that he was cursed, bewitched, or possessed. In truth, he was simply a genetic dead end. His inbreeding coefficient, yes, there is a number for this, was higher than if his parents had been siblings, which is impressive. In a tragic way, of course, Charles II wasn't unique. He was simply the most extreme example. Other Habsburgs also showed the results of centuries of closed genetic circles. Portraits of Philip IV, Ferdinand I, and Leopold I all revealed the same jutting jaw, the same drooping lip, the same weary, watery eyes. They were powerful emperors. They were also, physiologically, walking advertisements for genetic diversity. But let's drift away from Spain and Austria and slide gently into Egypt, because inbreeding wasn't a European invention. The ancient Ptolemies of Egypt, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals, were just as enthusiastic about family marriages. Cleopatra, the famous Cleopatra VII, is often remembered for her affairs with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. But before that, she had already married her own younger brother. Twice. This was standard practice for the Ptolemies. Brother and sister marriages were not only allowed, they were expected. The idea was to keep the bloodline godlike, pure, and above the common people, which is another way of saying they tied knots in their own DNA for generations. And yet, the Ptolemies weren't alone. Many dynasties across history practiced inbreeding to maintain their divine or royal status. The pharaohs of earlier Egypt, the Incas of Peru, the Hawaiian royal family. Each time, the reasoning was the same. Outsiders dilute us. Insiders keep us strong. Except, the results suggested otherwise. Let's return softly to Europe for a moment, to the Tudors. They weren't as inbred as the Habsburgs, but they still played a dangerous game. Henry VIII, in his quest for a male heir, married Catherine of Aragon, who happened to be his late brother's widow. This wasn't technically inbreeding, but it did involve a certain amount of recycling within families. Catherine, incidentally, was herself from the Spanish royal family, which was, of course, thoroughly Habsburg. Her daughter, Mary I of England, Bloody Mary, showed signs of inherited fragility. She suffered multiple phantom pregnancies, likely due to hormonal or ovarian issues. These reproductive struggles were common in royal families and often linked back to the same issue: too many shared ancestors. Even the Stuarts in Scotland and England weren't immune. James VI and who united the crowns of England and Scotland, was descended from multiple cousin marriages. He was intelligent but plagued with chronic health issues, trembling hands, and strange personal habits. One ambassador described him as the wisest fool in Christendom, which is not exactly the compliment he probably hoped for. Now, in fairness, not every inbred monarch was physically or mentally impaired. Some were competent rulers. But the trend was clear. The more they married within their family, the weaker their descendants became. It's almost as if genetics were trying to send them a message. What's striking is how stubbornly dynasties clung to this practice. Even when it became obvious that the heirs were fragile, infertile, or outright incapable of ruling, the idea of marrying outside the family was treated as scandalous. Bloodlines mattered more than functionality. Dynasties would rather collapse under the weight of their own chromosomes than risk mingling with common stock, which, in many cases, is exactly what happened. Charles II of Spain died childless in 1700. His dynasty extinguished. The Spanish crown passed to the French Bourbons, sparking a massive war over succession. The Habsburgs' obsession with purity ended not in triumph, but in genetic failure and political chaos. It's a fitting irony. They spent centuries protecting their blood, only to discover that it couldn't sustain them. So, as you drift off tonight, picture the great royal courts of Europe: velvet robes, golden crowns, glittering palaces, and inside them, pale, sickly monarchs, squinting through weak eyes and chewing awkwardly with misaligned jaws. Because of course they were. If there's one thing European royals loved more than expensive banquets or inventing new ways to avoid bathing, it was marrying for politics. Marry a cousin here, a niece there, and suddenly your family controls half of Europe. Very efficient. Unless, of course, you happen to be the children. Because while the weddings were magnificent affairs, trumpets, velvet gowns, processions down candlelit aisles, the honeymoons were often followed by dynastic migraines, heirs born sickly, daughters stillborn, sons that didn't survive past childhood, and entire dynasties eventually collapsing because, well, biology refused to play along with politics. Let's start with the Habsburgs again. I know, we already touched on them, but really, they kept giving us material. Consider Joanna of Castile, also known as Joanna the Mad. Now, calling her mad was, as usual, a bit of convenient sexism. She had mood swings, certainly, and paranoia, but it didn't help that her husband, Philip the Handsome, was constantly unfaithful. And by the way, the Handsome was a bit generous. He mostly looked like a fashionable turnip. Their marriage was the union of two extremely inbred houses. The result, 6 children, many of whom carried the combined weaknesses of both lines. Their grandson was none other than Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, whose jaw and general ill health marked him as yet another casualty of the family policy. Marry your cousin, save the empire, doom the offspring. And then, there's the story of Maria Anna of Spain and her marriage to Ferdinand III, Holy Roman Emperor. Maria Anna was Charles II of Spain's Antan. Like the rest of the Habsburgs, she had the jaw. The union was celebrated across Europe as a strengthening of the dynastic alliance. The result? Children who were fragile, prone to illness, and often died young. Of 10 offspring, only a handful lived to adulthood. That was fairly typical for the family. By the 17th century, a Habsburg christening often felt more like a coin toss. But the Habsburgs weren't alone in this genetic gamble. Let's float gently over to the British Isles. The Stuarts of Scotland and England also had their share of misjudged matches. Take Mary, Queen of Scots. She was married off at 16 to Francis II of France, who was just 15. Now, Francis was not exactly the image of robust masculinity. He was delicate, often ill, and about as sturdy as a damp sponge. Their marriage lasted only 2 years before Francis died of an ear infection that spread to his brain. which, admittedly, was not caused by inbreeding, but the fragility was all too common in dynastic unions. Mary's later marriages didn't improve matters. Her second husband, Lord Darnley, was also her cousin. Their son, James VI and I, grew up to unite Scotland and England under one crown, but he had weak health, trembling limbs, and a collection of phobias that suggest his genetic inheritance wasn't entirely kind. Now, one of the more tragic cases comes from the Russian throne. The Romanovs loved a good dynastic match, often pulling brides from the German principalities. It kept politics neat and the bloodline suitably royal. Unfortunately, it also meant concentrating recessive genes. The most famous result of this was the hemophilia carried by Queen Victoria of Britain's descendants. Victoria herself wasn't inbred compared to the Habsburgs, but her children married all across Europe. Her granddaughters carried the hemophilia gene into Spain, Germany, and Russia. And so, when Tsar Nicholas II married Alexandra of Hesse, Victoria's granddaughter, they produced the unfortunate Alexei, heir to the Russian throne. He was a hemophiliac. A single cut or bruise could be fatal. The family kept this a secret, but it dominated their lives. His constant illness and his mother's desperation for a cure eventually brought the mystic Rasputin into the palace. And Rasputin, of course, helped undermine what little credibility the monarchy had left, contributing in its own small way to the Russian Revolution. So, a genetic mishap from one dynastic marriage helped topple an empire, all because Queen Victoria's family tree was a little too interconnected. And we can't forget the Bourbons of France. Louis XIV, the Sun King, married Maria Theresa of Spain. Once again Habsburg blood. Their children were frail, with many dying in infancy. Of 6, only one legitimate son survived to adulthood. But even that line soon ran out. By the time of Louis XVI, a century later, the dynasty was hanging on by a thread though. To be fair, the guillotine did more damage than the genetics in that case. The irony of all this is how carefully arranged these marriages were. They were meant to secure stability, to strengthen kingdoms, to create heirs who united great empires. And yet, over and over, they produced heirs who couldn't walk properly, couldn't speak clearly, or couldn't survive childhood. Dynastic ambition was meticulous and utterly defeating. Now the royals themselves often noticed the pattern. They weren't oblivious. Letters survive where monarchs complain about their children's sickliness, or physicians politely note that perhaps a cousin to cousin match wasn't ideal, and yet, the practice continued. Because the alternative, marrying into a family without titles, was seen as far worse. Imagine being a perfectly healthy noblewoman from a powerful but non-royal family. Your blood could have refreshed the dynasty. Your womb could have saved an empire. But alas, you weren't related closely enough. So they married the cousin instead, and the empire limped on with another half-dead heir, because of course they did. So, as you sink deeper into your pillow, picture those royal weddings. The music, the dancing, the feasts. Everyone smiling and clapping. And somewhere, in the background, genetics quietly rolling its eyes. Now, if you've ever envied royal children for being born into luxury, let me soothe that thought away. Because royal childhood was rarely what it appeared. Yes, they had golden cradles and nurses fussing over them. Yes, their first toys were often miniature swords, silver rattles, or little crowns made of velvet. But behind the pomp was a very fragile existence. Let's start with the obvious. Infant mortality. For all the jewels, the castles, and the divine blessings, royal babies died at roughly the same rates as peasant babies, which is to say, alarmingly often. Take Henry VIII of England. For example, he and his many wives produced at least 6 children who died in infancy or were stillborn. Only 3 made it past early childhood, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. The rest were mourned quietly, sometimes not even recorded in detail. For all his palaces and feasts, Henry couldn't outspend medieval mortality rates. Even when royal children survived infancy, they were often sickly. Malnutrition was common not from lack of food, but from too much of the wrong food. Medieval diets for royals leaned heavily on meat, sugar, and wine, while vegetables were seen as peasant fare. So little princes and princesses grew up pale, bloated, and often riddled with digestive problems. Because of course, if you have 1,000 cooks, they will all try to impress you with roasted peacocks, and no one will think to offer you a carrot. And then there was the matter of upbringing. Royal children were rarely raised by their parents. They were handed over to nurses, tutors, and governesses. Their parents might visit occasionally, but affection was considered dangerous. Too much coddling could soften a future ruler. So childhood was an odd mixture of pampering and neglect. Take Edward VI of England, Henry VIII's only legitimate son. He grew up surrounded by scholars, groomed to be a Protestant prince. His education was impeccable, but his health was fragile. He was pale, small, and constantly ill. His tutors praised his mind, but worried about his body. He became king at 9 and was dead by 15, another child who never stood a chance, despite the crown on his head. In France, childhood was hardly easier. Louis XIV, the Sun King, grew up during a period of civil war known as the Fronde. As a child, he was sometimes forced to flee Paris in the middle of the night, bundled into carriages while mobs threatened the palace. He later confessed that these experiences left him permanently anxious, afraid of disorder and chaos, which, perhaps, explains why, as an adult, he built Versailles, an enormous gilded prison for the nobility, where no one could threaten him again. So, the boy who played with little golden toys became the man who locked his nobles into a permanent masquerade. Childhood fears linger, even under wigs and diamonds. And then, of course, there's the simple cruelty of dynastic expectation. Royal children were not children in the way we think of them today. They were heirs, bargaining chips, pawns on the dynastic chessboard. A daughter of 10 might be betrothed to a foreign prince she would never meet for another decade. A son of 12 might be treated as a miniature adult, given titles and responsibilities he could barely spell. Isabella of Valois, married to Richard II of England, was only 6 years old when the wedding took place. She spent much of her married life playing with dolls, while her husband faced political disaster. The marriage was never consummated, of course, but the absurdity of it speaks volumes. Childhood was irrelevant. The crown always came first. Health problems often compounded the misery. Charles VI of France, known as Charles the Mad, began showing signs of mental illness in his early 20s. But even as a boy, chronic fevers and nervous spells plagued him. Physicians bled him, dosed him with herbs, and prayed. None of it helped. His breakdowns as king believing he was made of glass, refusing to let people touch him, were the tragic flowering of a frailty that had been there since youth. The royal body was expected to be perfect, strong, divine, unshakable. But the reality was far weaker. The pressure to embody divine kingship sat heavily on pale, sickly shoulders. Let's drift now to the north, to Scandinavia. Eric of Pomerania, King of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway in the 15th century, had a childhood shaped by politics rather than affection. Raised by his great-aunt Queen Margaret, he was molded into a king from infancy. His real parents were sidelined. His tutors drilled him constantly. By the time he inherited the throne, he was more puppet than boy. And as an adult, he proved disastrous, aloof, paranoid, and eventually deposed. A childhood without nurture doesn't tend to produce a balanced monarch. And yet, even when pampered, royal children often fared no better. Louis XV of France was showered with luxury as a child. His every whim was indulged. But he grew up spoiled, indecisive, and perpetually bored. Courtiers described him as listless, drifting from toy to toy, tutor to tutor, without focus. His childhood indulgence bred an adult king who was nicknamed Louis the Well-Beloved in propaganda, but privately was known as Louis the Uninterested. The crown gilded their toys. It didn't protect their spirits. Even play could be dangerous. The young Edward of Westminster, son of Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, was raised amid the Wars of the Roses. He was said to be unusually aggressive as a boy, perhaps reflecting the violence of his environment. Chroniclers claimed he enjoyed talking about battles, beheadings, and revenge, even as a child. Whether that was propaganda or truth, it speaks to how royal childhoods were colored by politics. Even their games were war games. So, if you imagine royal nurseries filled with laughter and gentle lullabies, think again. They were places of constant anxiety. Every fever was a potential succession crisis. Every cough carried dynastic consequences. A prince with the flu might doom a kingdom. A princess's stillbirth might fracture an alliance. Childhood wasn't innocent. It was a battlefield, fought with cradles and swaddling cloths. And as you drift further toward sleep, picture these royal children curled in velvet beds, surrounded by tapestries and guards, yet pale, anxious, and frail. Their every breath watched by physicians, priests, and diplomats. Their lives not their own, their childhoods. Not really childhoods at all, because of course, they weren't. Royalty, for all their sermons about divine right and sacred duty, were often astonishingly petty. They had armies, palaces, treasuries, and yet they spent their time feuding over insults, gossip, and who got the bigger chair. Sometimes, quite literally, the bigger chair. Because, as you'll see, the higher the crown, the thinner the skin. Let's start in France, with the king who reigned for far too long. Louis XIV, the Sun King, a man who could command armies, bankrupt nations, and order entire palaces to be built from scratch. Yet he was utterly fixated on court etiquette. Who got to hand him his shirt in the morning? Who was allowed to watch him eat dinner? Which duke was permitted to stand one step closer to his chair? One ambassador remarked that Louis spent more time worrying about who handed him his napkin than about the Spanish succession, and it was true. His obsession with etiquette was so intense that courtiers wrote entire instruction manuals about how to bow properly at Versailles. And naturally, Louis was never wrong. Even when he was catastrophically wrong, he once dismissed a minister's concern about famine with the words, "If the people have no bread, they should eat grass." It wasn't Marie Antoinette who said that, it was Louis, and decades earlier. Of course, he said it because he was irritated that someone dared bring him bad news. The Sun King did not like clouds. Meanwhile, in Spain, things were even pettier. Philip II was a man of extraordinary paperwork. He was obsessed with details. So much so that he insisted on personally reading reports about everything from military campaigns to whether a village shoemaker had paid his tax. He would sit alone at night, surrounded by mountains of documents, scribbling notes, and correcting grammar. His empire stretched across the globe, yet he micromanaged it like an irritated bookkeeper. And of course, this led to absurd delays. Urgent requests for reinforcements sometimes sat for months, because Philip was busy debating whether a governor's phrasing was too casual. One might think the ruler of the largest empire on earth had better things to do, but no petty control was his true crown jewel. Now, let's drift over to England, which never lacked dysfunctional royals. Take Henry II and his family. He quarreled constantly with his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and their sons. At one point, his sons literally went to war against him, backed by their mother. Family dinners must have been delightful. Imagine carving a roast while your eldest son is raising troops against you. Henry, for his part, could be astonishingly petty in his treatment of Eleanor. After one rebellion, he locked her away for nearly 16 years. Not in a dungeon, but in genteel captivity, where she was guarded and carefully restricted, which, in some ways, might have been worse. A woman who had once ruled half of France was reduced to asking permission to travel to church. Henry himself was equally stubborn. He was known to throw himself on the floor in rages, chewing straw and shrieking like a child when things didn't go his way, which is probably not the royal image he wanted etched in stone. Across the Channel, the Holy Roman Empire provided its own absurdities. Frederick II, sometimes called the wonder of the world, was brilliant. He spoke 6 languages, wrote treatises on falconry, and dabbled in science. But he also had the temperament of a sulky teenager. When the Pope excommunicated him, Frederick responded by crowning himself King of Jerusalem. Alone, with his own hands, because if no one else would do it, then he'd just do it himself. He then declared himself in perfect standing with God, because naturally who else could argue with him? Let's drift south to Naples. There we find Joanna I of Naples, who is famous not so much for her governing skill as for her marital disasters. Her first husband, Andrew of Hungary, was deeply unpopular. One night he was attacked, strangled, and thrown from a balcony. Joanna was accused of orchestrating it, though, of course, she denied it. She then remarried, and remarried again, and again, for husbands in total, each marriage more political than affectionate. Her reign was riddled with scandal, feuds, and accusations, and yet she carried on with a kind of stubborn glamour, as though the rumors didn't matter. Dysfunctional. Yes, but in a strangely theatrical way. And then we have the kings, who were petty simply by being absent. Richard I of England, known as the Lionheart, barely spent any time in his own kingdom. He was too busy crusading, fighting, or being held prisoner. In fact, during his 10-year reign, he spent perhaps 6 months in England. The rest of the time, his subjects were left to pay heavy taxes for his adventures abroad. When asked once about his realm, Richard replied that he would sell London if he could find a buyer. It was not exactly a warm endorsement. For him, England was an ATM, not a homeland. The dysfunction was in his sheer neglect. Petty vendettas often consumed monarchs. Charles V of France once banned tournaments and jousts, because his brother had upstaged him in one. James I of England spent hours arguing with courtiers about whether tobacco was sinful, because he found smoking vulgar. Peter the Great of Russia forced his nobles to shave their beards not because it improved hygiene, but because he thought they looked backward and unfashionable. Those who refused had their beards physically pulled out by soldiers, because nothing says strong leadership like sending armed men to enforce facial hair policy. Perhaps the most tragic example comes from Charles II of Spain. We've met him before the Habsburg heir. So inbred he was barely functional. His pettiness wasn't intentional, it was woven into his dysfunction. He spent hours being carried from room to room, suspicious of servants, paranoid of witches, and deeply resentful that the laws of biology had betrayed him. His reign was essentially a long, drawn-out collapse. He left no heirs, of course, and the Spanish throne plunged into chaos. One can hardly blame him for his weakness, but it does highlight how petty dynasties could be, vesting so much in bloodlines that were doomed from the start. So, what ties all these royal fiascos together? The incredible ability of monarchs to turn immense power into small, personal grievances. They fought wars over chairs, sulked over etiquette, and executed rivals over whispered insults. Entire kingdoms suffered because a king had indigestion or a queen had a grudge. In short, the crown magnified every flaw. A petty man became a tyrant. A stubborn child became a despot. A spoiled daughter became a political disaster. Dysfunction wasn't a quirk, it was the foundation of their rule. And now, as the night deepens, you might reflect on the irony. Peasants lived short, harsh lives. But at least their family dinners didn't usually erupt into civil wars. Royals, meanwhile, had endless luxury, but their tables were battlegrounds of pride and paranoia. Not exactly a recipe for sweet dreams, but perhaps a gentle reminder that power in the wrong hands only makes people stranger. If you've spent any time wandering through the margins of royal courts, you'll notice a recurring figure. Not quite noble, not quite servant, not even technically. In the eyes of the era, a man, the eunuch. Now, the word itself tends to make modern audiences wince, but for much of history, eunuchs were everywhere. In palaces, in harems, in churches, sometimes mocked, sometimes feared, often resented, yet always close to power. Let's begin gently in ancient Byzantium. The Byzantine court was filled with eunuchs. They were administrators, generals, diplomats, even patriarchs of the church. Why? Because, in theory, they posed no dynastic threat. They couldn't found rival families or father competing heirs, which made them, at least in the minds of suspicious emperors, safer than ambitious dukes or cousins. And, of course, their liminal status made them useful. Eunuchs were thought to be loyal only to the throne. Many were, in fact, slaves or captives, taken young and reshaped quite literally into tools of the empire. It was a brutal system, but it produced some astonishing figures. One of the most famous was Narses, a eunuch general in the 6th century. He was described as frail and quiet, but on the battlefield he commanded armies with icy precision. At the age of 70, he defeated the Ostrogoths and brought Italy under Byzantine control. Not exactly the retirement hobby most people pick. And yet, to his enemies, he was dismissed as that old eunuch, which only made his victories sting more. Move forward a few centuries, and eunuchs were still thriving in Constantinople. During the Macedonian dynasty, they often acted as kingmakers. An emperor might trust his eunuch chamberlain more than his own brothers. Some even rose to become effective regents, ruling in all but name when emperors were weak or underage. Naturally, this inspired jealousy. Chroniclers often smeared eunuchs as sinister plotters, whispering in corridors, poisoning rivals, scheming behind silken curtains. Were they really worse than other courtiers? Probably not. But their very existence, half insider, half outsider, made them an easy target for paranoia. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, eunuchs served similar roles. In the Abbasid Caliphate, they guarded the harems, controlled access to rulers, and often became confidants of caliphs. In the Ottoman Empire, eunuchs gained even more prominence. The chief black eunuch in particular was one of the most powerful figures in the palace. He controlled not only the imperial harem, but also vast estates and political appointments. His role was so important that ambassadors would curry favor with him as much as with viziers. Imagine being a foreign diplomat, nervously handing gifts to a man who could, with a few words, decide whether your petition ever reached the Sultan's ears. It was a peculiar combination of humiliation and influence. Eunuchs were despised socially, yet indispensable politically. Stripped of family and legacy, they poured their ambitions into court intrigue. Even in China, eunuchs reached extraordinary heights. During the Ming Dynasty, the palace was crawling with eunuchs, sometimes tens of thousands of them. Their duties ranged from mundane cleaning to high-level administration. The most famous of all was Zhang He, the admiral who led vast treasure fleets across the Indian Ocean in the early 15th century. Picture it, a eunuch, once a prisoner of war, commanding enormous ships, sailing as far as East Africa, bringing giraffes back to Beijing. His expeditions dwarfed anything Columbus would attempt decades later. And yet Zhang He, despite his fame, remained bound by his eunuch status. No heirs, no dynasty, only service to the throne. But service, in its own way, was legacy. His voyages left ripples across Asia, remembered long after the eunuch himself was dust. Of course, not all eunuchs were great explorers or generals. Many were bureaucrats. Some were parasites. Their reputation was often one of greed, corruption, and cruelty. It's easy to see why. Powerless in one sense, they often clutched power in another. And when you spend your life trapped in a palace hierarchy, politics becomes your blood sport. Chinese historians frequently blamed eunuchs for dynastic decline. Whenever an emperor seemed weak, accusations of eunuch corruption quickly followed. It became almost a reflex. Something's gone wrong. Blame the eunuchs. A convenient scapegoat. Always available. Always slightly mistrusted. But behind the stereotypes were real, fragile lives. Most eunuchs had no choice in their fate. They were captured, enslaved, altered. They gave up family, children, and often their own names. Their only path to survival was service. Some became powerful. Many more died in obscurity, wandering palace corridors as half-seen figures in the background of history. Their tragedy was being both indispensable and despised. Everyone needed them. No one wanted to be them. And yet, the irony lingers. For all the emperors, kings, and sultans we remember, many of their legacies were shaped, filtered, or even preserved by eunuchs. They carried the documents, sealed the letters, opened the doors, whispered the secrets. The mighty rulers trusted them to guard their wives, raise their sons, and protect their palaces. Perhaps that is why eunuchs appear so often in history not as footnotes, but as shadows behind the throne. Their lives remind us that power doesn't always rest in crowns or swords. Sometimes it rests in the quiet, liminal figures who slip between categories, neither fully inside nor outside, but somehow everywhere. So, as we drift onward, picture the palace corridors by lamplight, the great ruler asleep, surrounded by riches, and outside the chamber, silent eunuchs keep watch. Their lives diminished, their influence immense. A paradox that endured for centuries. Pilgrimage. The word sounds peaceful, doesn't it? A spiritual journey, a holy walk, the medieval equivalent of a mindful retreat. And in theory, that's what it was meant to be. A way for ordinary people and, sometimes royals, when the mood struck to atone for sins, seek healing, or simply collect spiritual merit by trudging off to a shrine. But the reality of pilgrimage was less serene. It was exhausting, expensive, and frequently deadly. Let's start with the obvious. Distance. The most famous destination, of course, was Santiago de Compostela in Spain. Depending on where you started, the walk could be hundreds, even thousands of miles. No planes, no comfortable buses. Just your feet, blistered and bleeding, carrying you across mountains, rivers, and occasionally swamps. Pilgrims slept in barns, or on the side of the road, or in crowded hostels crawling with lice. They trudged through rain, snow, and heat, often with little more than a wool cloak and hope. And that was one of the safer pilgrimages. Others went to Rome, to Canterbury, to Jerusalem. Yes, Jerusalem, which required months of travel through hostile territories, dangerous seas, and deserts. A spiritual adventure, certainly, but also a near-death experience. Now, danger number 2. Robbers. Pilgrims were easy targets. They often carried offerings, coins, jewels, candles, little gifts for the shrine. They also carried travel funds. And unlike knights or merchants, they weren't usually armed or trained to defend themselves. Bands of thieves learned quickly that a pilgrim on the road was basically a walking wallet. To be mugged once on pilgrimage was unfortunate. To be mugged twice was practically expected. The irony being that you might return from your spiritual journey with your sins forgiven, but your purse considerably lighter. Then there was the matter of disease. Pilgrimage routes were notorious for spreading illness. Crowds of people from across Europe crammed into shared lodgings, breathing the same air, eating the same questionable food. Unsurprisingly, outbreaks were common. Pilgrimages could turn into rolling epidemics, carrying sickness from one region to another. One chronicler even suggested that the Black Death spread faster because of pilgrims stubbornly continuing their journeys despite the obvious plague-shaped problem. Because if you vowed to walk to Compostela, apparently not even a bubonic apocalypse should stop you. And then, of course, there were local authorities. Not every town welcomed pilgrims. They clogged roads, filled inns, and sometimes sparked fights. So towns began imposing pilgrim taxes. Imagine trudging along for 100 miles, only to be stopped by a guard who demanded a fee, because you were wearing a scallop shell badge on your hat. Pilgrims could be fined, searched, even jailed, if they caused trouble. It wasn't just the journey that was dangerous. Sometimes the pilgrims themselves became a problem. Large groups occasionally turned rowdy. Drinking, brawling, petty theft. Medieval chroniclers complained that pilgrimages were as much about adventure and partying as about piety. One particularly notorious pilgrimage was the Children's Crusade of 1212. Thousands of children, and probably just as many wandering adults, masquerading as children, set off for the Holy Land, convinced they could succeed where knights had failed. Most never arrived. Many starved, were enslaved, or simply disappeared. It was less a crusade and more a tragic mass pilgrimage of desperation, and it revealed how vulnerable these journeys could be when swept up by collective fervor. Even for kings, pilgrimage wasn't safe. Henry II of England, after being implicated in the murder of Thomas Becket, performed a humiliating pilgrimage to Canterbury. He walked barefoot to the cathedral, dressed as a penitent. When he arrived, he was whipped by monks, literally flogged before praying at Becket's tomb. A king reduced to tears, bleeding in the candlelight. Pilgrimage was dangerous to the body, but also to dignity. Of course, some people adored the risk. Pilgrimage became a kind of medieval tourism industry. Roads sprouted hostels, taverns, and markets catering specifically to pilgrims. Trinkets, fake relics, badges, and indulgences were sold at every stop. Pilgrimage guides even circulated medieval versions of Lonely Planet, warning which rivers were hardest to cross and which shrines had the best relics. But even then, there was no guarantee you'd return home. Many pilgrims simply vanished. Roads were long, graves shallow, names forgotten, and yet the journeys continued, year after year, century after century, because the promise was irresistible. To see a saint's bones, to touch a holy relic, to carry back a little badge of proof that you had walked the sacred path. It didn't matter that you might get robbed, whipped, or carried off by dysentery. Pilgrimage offered something peasants rarely had: purpose, the illusion of control over salvation, a road to holiness, one painful mile at a time. So, as you let your mind drift, picture those medieval pilgrims, trudging through the mud, leaning on walking staffs, clutching their meager belongings, blisters on their feet, fear in their eyes, hope in their hearts, a dangerous, foolish, noble journey all at once. Executioners, the very word feels heavy. For most of history, execution was a public act. It wasn't hidden away in sterile prisons or behind closed doors. It was a spectacle, a lesson, and depending on the mood of the crowd, a kind of entertainment. And at the heart of it stood the executioner, a man despised, feared, and avoided, yet utterly indispensable. Let's start with their social position. Executioners were paradoxical figures. They carried out the will of kings, lords, and councils. Their job was official, legal, sanctioned, but at the same time, society treated them as polluted, contaminated, tainted by the blood they spilled. In many towns, executioners were forced to live on the outskirts, literally at the edge of the walls. They were banned from markets, from inns, from churches. People crossed the street to avoid touching them. If they walked into a tavern, silence followed, and customers might slip out the back. And yet, when a sentence was handed down, who did everyone demand? The very man they refused to acknowledge. The job itself was not simple. Executioners were expected to master a variety of techniques: hanging, burning, drowning, breaking on the wheel, and of course the axe or sword. Each had its own rituals and expectations, and failure was disastrous. A clean beheading was considered merciful, even honorable. A botched one where the executioner hacked repeatedly at the neck while the victim screamed was seen as disgraceful. Crowds might riot. The executioner himself might be attacked. In some cases, the botched executioner was even punished for incompetence. Imagine going to work knowing that one slip could cost you your life. Naturally, this pressure produced stress. Some executioners drank heavily before performing. Others rehearsed obsessively. One German executioner, Franz Schmidt, kept meticulous notes of every single person he executed, over 300 in total during his career. His diary is oddly matter-of-fact, as though recording laundry lists. It was, for him, simply a trade. But executioners didn't only kill. They had a surprising set of side jobs, because no one wanted to touch the unclean work of death. Executioners often doubled as butchers, knackers, and street cleaners. They disposed of animal carcasses. They cleaned up battlefields. They even acted as proto-doctors, since their gruesome familiarity with anatomy made them useful for surgeries and treating wounds. In some German towns, executioners were respected as healers. People would sneak to them at night for ointments, bloodletting, or the resetting of bones. So the same man who cut off your neighbor's hand for theft might also patch up your sprained ankle. A strange dual role, both feared and secretly sought out. And then there was the matter of family. Execution was often hereditary. The job passed from father to son. Why? Because once your family was marked as executioners, no one else would marry into it. Your children were tainted by association. The only option was to marry other executioners' children, and so the cycle continued. Whole dynasties of executioners emerged, stretching across centuries. For instance, the famous Sanson family in France produced 6 generations of executioners, serving from the 1600s to the 1800s. They beheaded nobles during the French Revolution, including Louis XVI himself. It was a family business, as grim as any cobbler's workshop, just with a different set of tools. But it wasn't all tragedy. Some orphans did manage to rise. A few apprenticeships turned into trades. Skilled orphans could become journeymen, then masters. In rare cases, they even married into better families and pulled themselves into comfort. There are recorded examples of orphans who became respected clerks, scribes, or even city officials. But these were exceptions. Tiny cracks of light in a generally dark system. Royal orphans, of course, were a different story. When a noble child lost their parents, the guardianship of their inheritance became a prized commodity. Kings or lords might seize the child and their lands, managing both until the heir came of age. Naturally, this management tended to enrich the guardian far more than the orphan. So while peasant orphans were left to starve in alleys, aristocratic orphans were treated as political pawns. Take the case of Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII. She inherited vast estates at just 1 year old. This made her valuable property. She was married off at 12, widowed, and pregnant by 13, and had her son the future king before she was even a teenager. Technically, an orphan success story, though I suspect she might have disagreed with the cheerful label. The psychology of orphans in this period is hard to trace. They rarely left personal records, but court rolls, parish registers, and charitable accounts give us glimpses. We see children apprenticed at shocking ages. We see their names listed in burial records, often with the chilling phrase of no family. And once in a while, we see the kindness of strangers. A foster parent who left a small inheritance in their will. A guild that raised funds for the children of a deceased member. A widow who took in an abandoned baby. Little flickers of humanity in a society that, overall, had little room for the fragile. The sad truth is that most medieval orphans lived short, harsh lives. Their survival depended entirely on luck. Luck of being taken in by a monastery, luck of a guild adopting them, luck of finding a master who wasn't cruel. For every rare story of an orphan who rose to prominence, countless others faded, unrecorded. So, as your thoughts start to drift and soften, picture them, tiny figures on cobbled streets, thin hands reaching for scraps of bread, a bell ringing in the night as a convent's foundling wheel turns, another anonymous child disappearing into the care of nuns. Some survived. Many didn't, but all were part of the forgotten undercurrent of medieval life, the little ones left behind. At first glance, the idea sounds peaceful, a journey with fellow believers, walking toward a sacred shrine, singing hymns along the way. And yes, there were moments of beauty, rolling hills, candlelit chapels, the sense of shared purpose. But mostly, pilgrimages were dangerous, expensive, and frequently miserable. Let's start with the basics. People went on pilgrimage for many reasons. To seek healing, to fulfill a vow, to atone for sins, sometimes as punishment ordered by a court, and sometimes, let's be honest, as an excuse for a long holiday. Destinations ranged from local shrines, like that of St. Cuthbert in Durham, to long-haul treks, such as Santiago de Compostela in Spain, or even all the way to Rome or Jerusalem. Distances could stretch hundreds, even thousands of miles, on foot in medieval footwear, which is essentially to say, barefoot with aspirations. The dangers began immediately. The roads were not safe. Bandits lurked along highways. Pirates prowled the seas. Soldiers from one petty conflict or another harassed travelers. If you were lucky, you merely lost your purse. If unlucky, you lost your life. And then there was the weather. Pilgrims trudged through snow in winter, mud in spring, burning heat in summer. Illness spread easily in groups. Water was often contaminated. Food was scarce. Even healthy adults sometimes collapsed along the way. For children, the elderly, or the already sick pilgrimage could be a death sentence disguised as piety. Accommodations didn't help. While monasteries and hospices sometimes offered shelter, many pilgrims slept in barns, ditches, or overcrowded inns crawling with fleas. Bedbugs were essentially non-paying residents. If you carried valuables, you risked theft. If you carried nothing, you risked starvation. And then there were the relics. Pilgrimages were all about relics. Bones of saints, drops of blood, a feather from an angel's wing, or famously for entire heads of John the Baptist, depending on which church you asked. The trouble was, relics were not only spiritually powerful, but also financially valuable. Shrines charged fees. Souvenir sellers hovered outside, and pilgrims often spent their last coin on tokens to prove they'd been there. Now let's not forget the spiritual side effects. Yes, reaching Santiago or Canterbury was uplifting, but the road there could be filled with moral hazards. Pilgrim groups often included thieves, drunkards, and people seeking adventure rather than redemption. Brothels lined popular routes. Gambling and drinking were common. The Book of Marjorie Kemp, written by a medieval mystic who went on pilgrimage, complains constantly about her fellow travelers' lack of holiness. And she wasn't wrong. Essentially, pilgrimages could resemble long, poorly organized medieval festivals, complete with petty squabbles and questionable hygiene. And then there was the risk of simply not coming back. A pilgrimage to Jerusalem was especially perilous. Crossing seas meant storms and shipwrecks. The overland routes passed through hostile territories. Crusaders weren't the only ones who suffered along those paths. Ordinary pilgrims often faced extortion, imprisonment, or worse. Many set out and never returned. Families left behind could only assume their loved ones had vanished forever into the sands. So why do it? Despite the risks, people kept going. Because the rewards, at least in their minds, were eternal. Visiting the relic of a saint might heal an illness. Completing a vow might shave years off purgatory. Pilgrimage was both a physical act and a spiritual insurance policy, and for some, it was genuinely transformative. Pilgrims sometimes returned with a broadened sense of the world, new friendships, even new business contacts. For the luckiest, the pilgrimage offered not just danger, but meaning. But if we're being honest, the vast majority returned tired, sore, broke, and slightly disillusioned, which, in fairness, is also the experience of many modern package tours. So, as you lie back and let your thoughts wander, picture the pilgrim roads. A dusty line of figures trudging across Europe, staffs in hand, cloaks tattered, feet blistered, some praying earnestly, some muttering curses, all heading toward shrines glittering with gold, hoping for miracles that may or may not appear. And all along the way, dangers lurking in shadow, waiting for the weary and the unprepared. Medieval pilgrimage equal parts, devotion, adventure, and hazard. Imagine this: you've just been married. Maybe it was arranged, maybe it was for love, though that was rare enough. The feast is over, you've eaten your fill of dubious meat pies, and you're finally home, hoping for some peace. And then, just as you're trying to settle into married life, outside your house comes a crowd. They are banging pots and pans, beating drums, blowing horns, shouting rhymes that are less than flattering, and they will keep it up until you either come outside to face them, or give them something to make them go away. That, in essence, was chivalry. The practice was widespread across medieval and early modern Europe. In England, it was sometimes called a rough music. In France, in Germany, Katzenmusik or cat music. The idea was the same, a loud mocking serenade, often targeting newlyweds who were in some way unusual. Maybe the bride was much younger than the groom, or much older. Maybe the marriage was considered scandalous, like a widow remarrying too quickly, or a wealthy merchant marrying beneath him. Sometimes it was just because people thought the couple looked mismatched. And sometimes, let's be honest, the village just wanted an excuse to make noise. The rituals could be elaborate. Crowds would assemble after dark. They'd carry torches, clang metal objects, or play deliberately awful music. They'd chant rude verses, mocking the couple's looks, their behavior, or most pointedly, their wedding night. The underlying joke was always about sex, or the suspected lack of it. In some places, the crowd demanded money or drink to stop. In others, they wouldn't leave until the couple kissed in public, or let the neighbors into the house for a party. It was part social control, part rowdy entertainment. Chivalry wasn't always harmless. It could turn nasty. If a man was thought to be abusing his wife, or if a widow remarried a suspiciously young husband, the ritual could escalate into humiliation. Effigies might be paraded through the streets. Sometimes the groom was made to ride backward on a donkey, while the crowd jeered. It blurred the line between folk festival and outright bullying, and yet, oddly, it was accepted. Communities treated chivalry as a way to enforce moral order. By mocking those who stepped outside social norms, they kept everyone else in line. Authorities sometimes tried to suppress it. Medieval kings, city councils, and church officials issued decrees banning chivalry, calling it disorderly and sinful. But like many folk traditions, it proved resilient. People liked the noise too much. And besides, what better excuse to drink, sing, and bang pots in the night than the sanctity of tradition? By the early modern period, chivalry evolved. It spread into political protests, where crowds used the same noisy tactics to mock unpopular officials. In some places, it lingered into the 19th century, reappearing whenever communities wanted to express disapproval. So while today, we might honk car horns after a wedding or paint "just married" on the back of a car, medieval villagers preferred something a little more aggressive, keeping you awake all night with tin pans until you bribed them to leave. It's almost comforting in its absurdity. Picture a dark medieval street, timbered houses leaning overhead, the faint smell of smoke in the air. And then, suddenly an eruption of sound. Children clattering pots. Adults singing Bodhi verses. Dogs barking in confusion. The unlucky couple inside, pulling the bed covers over their heads, praying it will stop. But it didn't stop. Not until the neighbors were satisfied. The couple was embarrassed, and social order was somehow restored through noise. Chivalry half-joke, half-judgment. A reminder that in medieval life, even your wedding night wasn't safe from the eyes and the ears of your neighbors. Holiness was not an easy job. To be considered saintly, you didn't simply attend Mass, say your prayers, and donate to the poor. You had to be extreme. You had to live in a way so far removed from normal human behavior that people couldn't ignore it. Some did this through miracles healing the sick, or visions of Christ. But more often, medieval living saints were recognized by their sheer, relentless capacity for suffering. The word for this was asceticism, the denial of comfort, pleasure, or even basic bodily needs, all in the name of holiness. Saints weren't supposed to enjoy life. They were supposed to endure it. Take, for example, Catherine of Siena. She lived in the 14th century, and by all accounts was bright, devout, and stubborn. She also ate so little that she practically starved herself to death. She believed her body should be denied, purified, kept empty for God. When her confessors tried to make her eat, she resisted, claiming it was not food, but only Christ's body in the Eucharist that sustained her. Eventually, this pious stubbornness killed her at the age of 33. To her contemporaries, this was sanctity. To modern doctors, it sounds suspiciously like anorexia nervosa wrapped in theology. Or consider Simeon Stylites, a Syrian ascetic from late antiquity whose legend was retold and admired throughout the medieval period. He became famous for living on top of a pillar. Not for a day, not for a week, but for decades. He perched there, exposed to the weather, refusing to come down. People flocked to gawk at him. They asked for blessings. And Simeon, standing above them like some weather-beaten bird, became one of the most famous holy men in Christendom. The message was clear. The more uncomfortable you were, the holier you appeared. In the Middle Ages, living saints were sometimes identified not by miracles, but by their ability to suffer visibly. Some wore hair shirts, garments of rough animal hair that chafed constantly. Others whipped themselves daily. Some refused to bathe, so that their bodies stank, but their souls, allegedly, remained fragrant to God. And then there were the holy women who deliberately sought humiliation. They wandered streets, begging, pretending to be mad, or throwing themselves into situations where they would be mocked. The logic was that by imitating Christ's suffering to humiliation, rejection, they too could draw closer to the divine. Communities both revered and resented these figures. On one hand, people marveled at their holiness. They whispered of miracles. They brought sick relatives for blessings. They donated food or coin to support them. On the other hand, imagine living next door to someone who never bathed, wailed in the streets at odd hours, and insisted on fasting noisily during feast days. It could be, in a word, inconvenient. Sometimes church officials tried to rein in these living saints. They worried about heresy, about people following charismatic individuals rather than priests. But often, the local population adored them too much to stop. There's also the political side. Some living saints became highly influential. Bridget of Sweden, for example, claimed to receive direct revelations from Christ, which she then delivered to kings and popes. Imagine being a medieval ruler and having to consider not only your bishops and generals, but also a stern woman insisting that Jesus had personally told her you were doing everything wrong. And rulers did listen, because saints were dangerous in their own way. To persecute them risked looking ungodly. To ignore them risked public scandal. So these odd, suffering figures, living half outside society, could wield enormous moral power. Of course, not every so-called saint ended well. Some died of their extreme practices: starvation, exposure, untreated infections. Others were quietly forgotten when their prophecies failed or their miracles didn't materialize. But a few were canonized, immortalized in stained glass and manuscripts. Their reputations outlasted them. So what was it like to be a living saint? Lonely, painful, often absurd. You denied yourself food, drink, comfort, cleanliness. You were stared at by neighbors, visited by pilgrims, tested by priests. You lived at the edge of human endurance, because to suffer was to imitate Christ, and to imitate Christ was to be holy. And when you did, emaciated, exhausted, and probably lice-ridden people gathered at your tomb, touched your bones, and whispered prayers, because in the medieval imagination, nothing was more powerful than suffering well. So, as your eyes begin to close, imagine them: a woman kneeling in rags in a stone chapel, refusing food, a man swaying on top of a pillar, sun beating down, birds circling, the townsfolk below, half admiring, half bewildered, and the sense that holiness was not comfort, but pain. Living saints eccentric, tormented, and yet, somehow, adored. Royal authority was supposed to be inspiring. You were God's anointed, chosen to rule. You were supposed to project dignity, majesty, and grandeur. And then, inevitably, you threw a tantrum. Take Charles VI of France, known to history as Charles the Mad. He reigned during the late 14th and early 15th centuries, and, yes, he suffered from severe bouts of mental illness. But what caught his subjects' attention was his insistence, at one point, that he was made of glass. He ordered iron rods sewn into his clothes so he wouldn't shatter. He also forbade people from touching him too suddenly, in case he broke. Imagine trying to conduct royal business with a king who flinched at handshakes because he believed he might splinter like a wine goblet. Or let's look at Queen Juana of Castile, more famously remembered as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, after her husband Philip the Handsome died. And yes, he was called handsome while looking like an underfed adolescent with a bowl cut. Juana refused to part with his body. She traveled around with his coffin, reportedly opening it to gaze upon him, and would not allow him to be buried for years. It was less a romance than an obsession, and it made governing Spain somewhat complicated. Then there was King Ludwig II of Bavaria, centuries later, but his pettiness was legendary in its own way. Obsessed with building fairy tale castles, Neuschwanstein, among others, he spent his kingdom's fortune on architectural fantasies, while neglecting state affairs. Ministers grew exasperated. Bavaria slid into debt. But Ludwig remained committed to his dream world of Wagnerian opera and turreted castles. It's beautiful now, Of course, tourists flocked to Neuschwanstein, but at the time, it was considered ruinously childish. Royal dysfunction could also appear in sibling rivalries. Consider Henry VIII of England and his elder brother Arthur. Arthur was the golden child, groomed to inherit the throne. Henry was the spare. But when Arthur died young, Henry inherited not only the crown but also Arthur's widow, Catherine of Aragon. This set the stage for Henry's lifelong obsession with producing a male heir and his eventual break with Rome. It is as though a sibling rivalry reached from the grave and reshaped the entire religious map of Europe. Some monarchs were petty in their punishments. Peter, the Great of Russia, was modern in many ways. He westernized Russia, built St. Petersburg, and forced nobles to shave their beards. But he could also be astonishingly vindictive. When he suspected his own son, Alexei, of conspiring against him, Peter had him tortured so severely that the young man died. For all his modernizing energy, Peter treated family life like an interrogation chamber. Others displayed their dysfunction through court etiquette. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, perfected this. He demanded nobles attend his morning lever, his ritual of waking up, dressing, and being admired. Nobles competed for the privilege of handing him a shirt or holding his chamber pot. It was glorified servitude disguised as honor. And Louis reveled in the petty hierarchies of who got to stand closest to his bed. Beneath the grandeur of Versailles was the ego of a man who believed his every yawn deserved applause. Then we have Christian, the Seventh of Denmark. He reigned in the 18th century and was plagued by mental illness, which manifested in odd, sometimes juvenile behavior. He would compulsively play with his gloves, slap people he disliked, or vanish for hours to wander the streets in disguise. His reign became a political farce, controlled more by advisors and, eventually, his wife's lover than by the king himself. Royal marriages, naturally, were fertile ground for dysfunction. Take George IV of Britain. He despised his wife Caroline so much that on their wedding night, he reportedly got drunk, collapsed, and spent most of the night unconscious on the floor. Later, when Caroline returned to England after years abroad, George tried to block her from being crowned queen. The two waged a marital Cold War in public, each airing grievances before the nation. It was less happily ever after, and more reality show with powdered wigs. And finally, we cannot forget the petty insults between monarchs themselves. When Frederick the Great of Prussia and Maria Theresa of Austria clashed in the 18th century, Frederick mocked her as a sentimental mother, unsuited for war. Maria Theresa, in turn, called Frederick a dishonest thief. Their insults were traded through armies, each sending thousands of men to their deaths over the ownership of Silesia. Entire wars were fueled not only by territory but by bruised egos. So what do we learn from these royal tantrums, delusions, and rivalries? That monarchy, for all its splendor, was often remarkably fragile. Kingdoms were run by people who cried, sulked, or built unnecessary castles. Their dysfunctions shaped policy, toppled alliances, and sometimes dragged entire nations into chaos. And as you let your eyes grow heavy, you can take comfort in this. No matter how awkward your last family argument was, it almost certainly didn't plunge Europe into war. We like to imagine medieval monarchs as practical people concerned with taxes, borders, and alliances. And yes, sometimes they were. But just as often, they were peering anxiously at horoscopes. Astrology was not a fringe hobby. It was woven into the very fabric of medieval and Renaissance politics. The alignment of planets, the phases of the moon, the time of birth, all of these rulers believed, shaped their destiny. Take Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France in the 16th century. She adored her astrologer, Nostradamus. Yes, the very same Nostradamus whose vague prophecies are still misquoted today. Catherine invited him to court, consulted him obsessively, and even trusted him to predict the fates of her children. And considering that several of those children ended up as weak kings, embroiled in France's bloody wars of religion, one might argue his predictions weren't exactly reassuring. Astrology was serious business. royal astrologers determined the best dates for weddings, coronations, and military campaigns. No one wanted to march into battle under an unlucky star. Even childbirth was timed, when possible, to align with favorable constellations. For example, Elizabeth I of England was crowned in January 1559, but only after her astrologer John Dee confirmed the date was auspicious. Dee, by the way, was not just a stargazer, he was also a mathematician, geographer, and occultist who spent his spare time trying to summon angels. Elizabeth valued him enough to overlook the stranger hobbies. And then there's Wallace of Scotland actually. No, not William Wallace, but James IV of Scotland, a king who trusted astrologers to such an extent that he built a special observatory at Stirling Castle. He wanted direct access to the heavens, right above his royal residence. This, at least, was a constructive use of superstition. It advanced astronomy while scratching his mystical itch. But astrology wasn't just about reading the skies. It blended with other forms of fortune-telling, palmistry, dream interpretation, and scrying with mirrors or water bowls all found their way into court. Monarchs wanted reassurance. They wanted glimpses of the future. Even emperors who commanded armies craved certainty about whether their heirs would survive or whether a marriage alliance would bring peace. Sometimes, this dependence turned dangerous. When predictions were unfavorable, monarchs grew paranoid. A prophecy that a ruler would die soon could trigger purges of suspected traitors or frantic attempts to cheat fate. Ironically, the very effort to avoid destiny often brought about disaster. One classic example is Henry II of France. Astrologers warned him that his death would come through a duel, marked by a wound through the eye. He scoffed, because he was a strong, confident king. But in 1559, during a jousting tournament, a splinter from his opponent's lance pierced his visor and drove into his eyes. He died days later. Nostradamus's prediction, whether coincidental or cleverly interpreted afterwards, suddenly looked uncomfortably accurate. Astrology also played a role in royal paranoia about succession. If a horoscope suggested that a son might overthrow his father, watch out. That child's future suddenly became precarious. In some cases, advisors manipulated horoscopes to flatter or frighten rulers, bending the stars to political ends. If you wanted to persuade a monarch to delay a campaign, simply point out that Mars was retrograde. Of course, skepticism existed too. Some monarchs mocked astrologers. Others used them only for show. But even when rulers doubted, their courtiers often believed and political pressure could make astrology unavoidable. Take Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. He had access to some of the best scholars of the age, but still kept astrologers in his court. Not because he fully trusted them, but because his nobles expected it. Better to appear cautious and celestial-minded than risk looking impious. So what did all this mean for the average subject? It meant their lives could be swayed by the stars, at least indirectly. Battles might be delayed. Taxes might be imposed on auspicious dates. Marriages and alliances might rise or fall, depending on whether Venus looked friendly. Behind the grandeur of kingship, much of policy was quite literally up in the air. Astrology eventually fell from royal favor, especially by the Enlightenment. Courts began to embrace science, dismissing fortune-telling as superstition. But echoes lingered. Napoleon famously consulted fortune-tellers, so did Hitler. Centuries later, the royal obsession never fully died, it just went private. So, as you drift toward sleep, picture it. A vast hall lit by flickering candles. The monarch on a throne, but with anxious eyes. Before them, an astrologer in velvet robes pointing at a parchment chart of stars. Courtiers leaning in, whispering. The fate of kingdoms balanced on the position of Saturn. Because sometimes, all it took to change history was the movement of planets across the sky. We like to imagine royal children surrounded by luxury. Silken cradles, jewel-encrusted toys, tutors reciting Latin at their bedside. And yes, there was luxury. But there was also illness, fear, and a very peculiar kind of neglect. Being born royal meant you were precious, but not necessarily loved in the way we think of today. Infant mortality was the great shadow. Even kings and queens couldn't escape it. In some dynasties, half the royal children died before adulthood. Smallpox, measles, dysentery, and pneumonia cut through palaces just as easily as cottages. Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, for instance, had multiple children die in infancy before their daughter Mary survived. Royal nurseries were often little more than rooms of grief, full of wet nurses, priests performing hurried baptisms, and parents praying desperately for survival. Then there was the question of child-rearing philosophy. Modern parenting advice, with its focus on attachment and emotional well-being, would have been unrecognizable. Royal children were often handed off to wet nurses, governesses, or entire households of attendants. Parents might see their children only occasionally, treating them more as dynastic assets than as family members. Take Louis XIV of France. His mother, Anne of Austria, loved him in her way. But from infancy, he was raised to believe he was semi-divine, the Sun King in training. He was coddled, obeyed, and worshipped by attendants. The result? A child who grew into a man, convinced that other humans existed mainly to hand him slippers and admire his wig. Other children endured the opposite fate, neglect cloaked as discipline. Edward VI of England, son of Henry VIII, grew up sickly and lonely. His tutors pressed religion and statecraft onto him, but his frail health meant he rarely played outdoors. By his teens, he looked more like a tired clerk than a future king. He died at just 15, leaving behind a legacy of Protestant reforms but very little personal joy. Royal children were also political pawns. Marriage contracts were negotiated while they were still in the cradle. A 6-year-old princess might be promised to a foreign prince she'd never met, then packed off across the sea as soon as she reached adolescence. Childhood was not a private journey, but a public performance, with every milestone scrutinized by ambassadors and chroniclers. Consider Mary, Queen of Scots. She was betrothed to the French Dauphin when she was just 5. At 6, she was shipped to France, far from her homeland, to be raised in a foreign court. Her childhood was gilded, but not truly. Her on it was scripted for her by politics. And of course, there were the illnesses. Royal medicine was hardly better than peasant remedies, sometimes worse. Thanks to overzealous physicians with leeches and potions, children were dosed with purgatives, wrapped in charms, and subjected to bleeding if they developed fevers. All this weakened fragile bodies further. It's a wonder any of them survived at all. But even those who survived often grew into deeply odd adults. Some were spoiled beyond recognition. Others were scarred by isolation. Think of Charles II of Spain, whose inbred Habsburg lineage left him physically and mentally impaired. His childhood was one long catalogue of illness and failure. Yet courtiers still bowed and scraped before him, pretending all was well. His toys included miniature suits of armor, though he could barely walk without assistance. Childhood in palaces could also be crushingly lonely. The young Marie Antoinette, before her marriage, played with dolls and danced in the gardens of Schönbrunn Palace, but always under the watchful eye of attendants. Once she was sent to France, her childhood effectively ended. At 14, she became queen-in-waiting, responsible not for play, but for producing heirs. So, royal childhoods were not fairy tales. They were a mixture of fear, privilege, pressure, and frequent illness. To be born royal was to be both protected and exposed. Protected by guards and gold, exposed to politics, superstition, and disease. As your eyes grow heavier, picture the royal nursery, a vast chamber with tapestries on the walls, a cradle rocking gently by the fire, a nurse humming a lullaby in Latin, and just outside the door ambassadors already negotiating what this tiny life might mean for kingdoms. The child stirs, coughs, and sleeps again. Their future already decided. You'd think, with all their luxury pelisses silks, jeweled goblets, that monarchs would also enjoy frequent baths. Not so. Many rulers were astonishingly suspicious of soap and water. The medieval and early modern belief was simple and grim. Water opened the pores. And once your pores were open, disease could sneak in. To bathe too often, people believed, was to invite sickness. And so, paradoxically, cleanliness was thought to be unhealthy. Louis XIV of France is a favorite example. The Sun King, who built the glittering Palace of Versailles, reportedly took only a handful of baths in his entire life. He preferred linen shirts changed frequently to absorb sweat and dirt. Linen was believed to draw out impurities. So rather than washing, Louis simply changed his clothes multiple times a day. By the end of it, his body might not have been cleaner, but his laundry pile was monumental. He was hardly alone. Queen Elizabeth I of England declared that she bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not, and this was considered progressive. Elizabeth's courtiers thought her unusually clean. By comparison, many nobles washed only a few times a year. Some rulers went decades without a proper bath. James VI of Scotland later, James I of England hated bathing and even changing his clothes. He wore the same garments until they fell apart, insisting that frequent washing was dangerous. Courtiers commented, not entirely kindly, on his odor. He also avoided dentistry, preferring to let his teeth rot quietly. Oddly enough, earlier centuries had been cleaner. In the early Middle Ages, public bathhouses were common across Europe, a legacy of Roman traditions. Kings like Charlemagne enjoyed long soaks, sometimes inviting friends and attendants to bathe with him. But by the later Middle Ages, fear of disease and associations with immorality since, bathhouses were often linked to brothels made bathing less fashionable. So, strangely, royal hygiene regressed. And then there were the medical treatments that made matters worse. If a king had a skin condition, doctors often prescribed avoiding water entirely. Instead, they recommended powders, perfumes, and layers of fabric. The result, courts filled with heavily scented monarchs, masking their unwashed state with rosewater or musk. Perfume was not just fashion, it was survival. Without it, you might faint in a crowded hall. The irony is that poor people sometimes bathed more often than kings. Rivers, ponds, and communal baths were more accessible to villagers than perfumed chambers were to monarchs. Royalty, in their paranoia, often chose the less healthy option. This lack of bathing had consequences. Skin infections, lice infestations, and dental decay plagued courts. Elizabeth I famously had blackened teeth from too much sugar and too little cleaning. Louis XIV lost most of his teeth by middle age and had such terrible dental abscesses that eating became a challenge. Courtiers whispered about the king dribbling soup down his chin. And still, they avoided water. Not every ruler was smelly, of course. Some took hygiene seriously. Catherine de' Medici, for instance, was known to enjoy perfumed baths, and in the Islamic world, rulers maintained stronger bathing traditions, with grand hammams and ritual purification. But in much of Christian Europe, suspicion of water lingered well into the 18th century. So, when you picture Versailles, don't just imagine mirrors and chandeliers, imagine the scent. Dozens of courtiers packed into gilded rooms, sweating under heavy brocade, masking the odor with overwhelming clouds of perfume, a dazzling palace. With questionable air quality, as your eyes drift now, imagine a royal chamber. Candles flickering, tapestries muffling the draft, and in the center, a monarch changing into yet another linen shirt, while the bath, neglected in the corner, grows dusty. For in the world of kings and queens, hygiene was a luxury they preferred to avoid.
Pets in royal households were not just companions, they were symbols. Owning an exotic beast showed wealth, power, and the ability to command the far corners of the world. And sometimes they were simply loved, though often in ways that alarmed courtiers. Dogs were the most common. Medieval kings adored their hunting hounds. Henry VIII kept entire packs with specialized dogs for boar, deer, and birds. Charles II of England was so fond of his spaniels that the breed Cavalier King Charles, spaniels is still named for him. Court diarists complained that his little dogs ran loose in royal chambers, even during state meetings. One ambassador grumbled that serious business was constantly interrupted by yapping and fur. But ordinary pets weren't enough. Monkeys were fashionable among the wealthy. They arrived via trade routes, often from Africa or Asia. Royals dressed them in tiny outfits, taught them tricks, and laughed when they misbehaved, which was often Imagine a grand banquet interrupted by a monkey in velvet trousers climbing onto the table to steal a roasted pheasant. And then came the truly exotic pets. Medieval kings loved lions. The Tower of London housed a menagerie as early as the 1200s, with lions, leopards, and even a polar bear gifted by the King of Norway. The bear was allowed to fish in the Thames, chained by the neck, startling Londoners with its daily swims. In France, Charles V kept a giraffe. In Portugal, King Manuel I was gifted an elephant named Hanno by the Pope in the early 1500s. Hanno became a celebrity, adored by the court, painted by artists, and paraded through Lisbon. Sadly, he died young after being overfed with gold-flecked laxatives by well-meaning but clueless physicians. His death was mourned like that of a prince. Even more curious was the habit of keeping birds. Falcons were essential for hunting, but parrots became fashionable too. Their ability to mimic speech delighted courtiers. One parrot belonging to Henry VIII reportedly shouted insults so convincingly that visitors thought the king himself was in a foul mood.
Of course, some royal pets met less glamorous fates. Animals were expensive to feed and house. When monarchs lost interest, they were neglected or given away. And in darker moments, they became pawns in politics. Enemies sometimes mocked rulers by comparing them to their animals, suggesting that a king was as lazy as his lapdog or as foolish as his monkey. But often, pets brought genuine comfort. Lonely princesses wrote letters describing the solace of a faithful dog. Monarchs took their animals into exile. Richard II of England, when imprisoned, was said to grieve more for the loss of his favorite greyhound than for his crown. Pets were reminders that even in palaces, affection could be simple. So when we picture medieval courts, it's not just gilded halls and grim politics. It's also barking dogs, squawking parrots, and the occasional monkey dressed like a miniature knight. A strange mixture of majesty and chaos. As you settle into sleep, imagine it. A torch-lit hall, courtiers whispering, nobles bowing low. And in the middle of it all, a tiny spaniel curled on a throne cushion. A monkey tugging at a noble's wig. A lion roaring faintly from its cage below the tower. The sound of politics and the sound of pets. In theory, a royal deathbed was supposed to be serene. The monarch, surrounded by family and clergy, would utter wise last words, receive the sacraments, and pass gracefully into memory. In reality, it was often messy, undignified, and followed by bizarre rituals. Take Louis XIV of France. After more than 70 years on the throne, the Sun King faced the slow decay of gangrene. His leg turned black. The stench filled Versailles, and courtiers whispered prayers that he might finally die. Louis himself admitted, "Why weep? Did you think I would live forever?" It was a rare moment of clarity in a court built on denial. And once he was gone, his body was subjected to the peculiar medieval practice of division. His flesh, his heart, and his entrails were separated, embalmed, and buried in different locations. The idea was that a king was too important to be contained in a single grave. Then there was Henry VIII of England. His death in 1547 was far from peaceful. Grossly obese, ridden with ulcers, and probably diabetic, he could barely move in his final months. His last words were not lofty. He could hardly speak at all. After his death, his massive corpse was placed in a coffin that leaked. As it lay overnight in a church, fluid seeped out. Chroniclers, never missing a chance for symbolism, declared that dogs were found licking at the puddle. For the man who had torn down monasteries and claimed divine authority, it was not the ending he might have imagined. Royal deathbeds were also occasions for politics. Who got access to the dying king mattered. Whose hand he squeezed, whose name he muttered, these could determine the succession. Courtiers jockeyed for position at the bedside, hoping for a final sign of favor. Edward the Confessor, last of the Anglo-Saxon kings of England, supposedly pointed to Harold Godwinson on his deathbed, giving him the crown. But Norman chroniclers later insisted he had meant it for William the Conqueror instead. That single moment of unclear mumbling sparked one of the most famous battles in history: Hastings, 1066, and then there were monarchs who clung stubbornly to life. Charles II of Spain, the last of the inbred Habsburg line, suffered from epilepsy, deformities, and chronic illness. His death was prolonged agony. Priests performed endless exorcisms at his bedside, convinced he was bewitched. Candles flickered, holy water was sprinkled, relics were pressed to his body. But nothing worked. He lingered miserably, until finally expiring at age 38. His childless death ended a dynasty and plunged Europe into war. Death was followed by display. Monarchs were not simply buried. They were paraded. Their bodies, sometimes embalmed badly, were carried through the streets so subjects could see their faces one last time. Sometimes wax effigies replaced the real corpse in case decomposition had set in. At Henry VII's funeral, his embalmed body lay beside a wax version of himself. Two kings, one living, one unnervingly still. And of course, death was an opportunity for ritual excess. Tombs were commissioned years in advance, costing fortunes. Processions stretched for miles with priests chanting, nobles weeping theatrically, and bells tolling across the land. Yet beneath the grandeur, there was always the fragile body of a once mighty monarch reduced to silence. So what was a royal deathbed like? It was theatrical. It was political. It was unhygienic. It was, in its way, the final performance of monarchy, the last chance to remind subjects that their ruler was chosen by God, even as the Worms were already preparing their welcome. As you close your eyes now, picture it: a dim chamber, heavy curtains, the king pale on the pillows, courtiers holding candles, whispering prayers, a priest pressing a crucifix to fading lips. Outside, the sound of bells carrying across the fields. And then silence. The king is gone. The crown waits for another head. Because even for monarchs, the end was only a pause in the long, strange story of history.